I didn't realize the silence was louder online. When we first started arguing through screens instead of across a table, it felt almost civilized, as if the distance between our faces created a layer of protection that would prevent things from escalating, as if the soft glow of our phones acted as a filter that strained out cruelty and left only carefully typed frustration. But what I didn't understand then was that distance does not soften conflict, it distorts it. And distortion has a way of magnifying the very things we think we are controlling. It began subtly, the way most emotional shifts do, not with shouting or accusations, but with pauses that lasted a little too long, with messages read but unanswered, with tone interpreted rather than heard. And I found myself staring at 3 blinking dots on a screen, as if they held more power over my nervous system than his physical presence ever had, because those dots represented anticipation, and anticipation is often more destabilizing than reality. In person, when we disagreed, I could read his shoulders, his breathing, the micro expressions that softened his words, even when his sentences were sharp. And even when tension filled the room, there was still a human rhythm between us, a shared physical space that forced us to regulate in real time. But online, everything became fragmented, tone detached from intention, silence detached from context, and I started responding not to what he meant, but to what I feared he meant. It felt safer at first. Safer to type what I wouldn't say out loud, safer to edit myself before pressing send, safer to delete something cruel before it landed. Yet the strange paradox was that the screen didn't reduce my intensity, it amplified my assumptions, and without his eyes in front of me, I projected my insecurities onto blank space and called it clarity. There's something about digital space that invites interpretation, and interpretation is fertile ground for self-doubt, especially for someone like me who has always been sensitive to emotional shifts, who notices when warmth drops by half a degree, who can detect distance before it is consciously declared. And so when his replies became shorter, when punctuation changed, when emojis disappeared, I didn't see neutrality, I saw withdrawal. I told myself I was being rational, but rationality and anxiety can look frighteningly similar when filtered through a screen. One evening, we argued for 3 hours without raising our voices, because our voices were never involved. We were in separate rooms of the same apartment, texting instead of speaking, and I remember thinking how absurd it was that the wall between us felt thicker than it ever had, not because of concrete, but because of interpretation, because every sentence arrived stripped of warmth, stripped of humanity. Online, everything becomes evidence. A delayed response becomes proof of indifference. A short answer becomes confirmation of resentment. A period at the end of a sentence becomes hostility. And the mind, hungry for coherence, builds a story around these fragments until the story feels more real than the relationship itself. Somewhere in the middle of all that typing, I stopped trying to understand him and started trying to win, not loudly, not dramatically, but strategically, choosing words that would corner him, framing questions that demanded confession rather than conversation. And I justified it by telling myself that clarity required precision, even though precision without compassion is just control wearing intellectual perfume. For a while, I believed the problem was communication style, that we simply needed boundaries around phone use. Maybe a rule about not arguing over text after 9 p.m., maybe an agreement to wait before responding. And I even felt a brief wave of relief when we decided to implement those rules, as if structure alone could repair the subtle erosion that had already begun beneath the surface. It worked, at least it seemed to. Our conversations became shorter, more measured, less reactive. And for a few weeks, I felt proud of us, proud of our maturity, proud that we had identified the problem and addressed it like adults who understood emotional regulation. And I allowed myself to believe that the tension had been technological rather than relational. But relief can be deceptive when it rests on avoidance. The silence returned, only this time it was quieter, more disciplined, less chaotic, but somehow heavier. And I began to notice that even when we weren't fighting online, we weren't fully connecting offline either. As if the habit of digital defensiveness had rewired something subtle in our nervous systems, teaching us to anticipate attack instead of intimacy. I once read a passage in an ebook about emotional patterns and how repeated micro-conflicts can train the brain to expect threat in neutral situations, and I remember feeling an uncomfortable recognition settle in my chest because our online arguments were no longer isolated events. They were rehearsals, rehearsals for mistrust, rehearsals for distance, rehearsals for emotional self-protection. We weren't yelling more online. We were assuming more. An assumption is a quiet form of aggression. I started noticing how quickly my heart rate increased when his name appeared on my screen. Even if the message was neutral, how my body braced before I even opened it. And that reaction had nothing to do with what he wrote and everything to do with what I had learned to expect. Because our digital conflicts had conditioned me to read between lines that didn't exist. In person, when we disagreed, there were natural interruptions, a sigh, a hand gesture, a shift in posture, reminders that we were two flawed humans navigating discomfort. But online, there were no interruptions, only continuous narrative. And without interruption, the mind fills space with its worst interpretations. I began to realize something unsettling. The screen wasn't creating new problems. It was removing the buffers that once softened them. Without eye contact, empathy requires more effort. Without touch, reassurance requires more intention. Without tone, kindness requires more clarity. And we were not putting in that extra effort. We were assuming it would happen automatically, the way it once did when our arguments ended with reluctant smiles across a kitchen table. The internal shift happened slowly, almost imperceptibly. When I stopped asking myself why he was responding that way and started asking why I was reacting so intensely, because beneath my frustration was something more fragile: fear of being misunderstood, fear of not being prioritized, fear of emotional abandonment disguised as irritation about response times. Online, those fears had room to expand. Offline, they had to share oxygen with reality. I noticed that when we argued face to face, my anger softened faster because I could see his confusion, his defensiveness, his humanity, but through a screen he became an idea rather than a person. And it is always easier to fight an idea than to sit with a flawed human being. Another quiet break came when I realized that I had started crafting messages, not to resolve conflict, but to protect my pride. Rereading my words to ensure they sounded composed, intelligent, emotionally superior even. And that subtle need to appear unshaken was creating more distance than any delayed reply ever could. It wasn't about the phone anymore. It was about power. Digital arguments gave me control over timing, phrasing, delivery, and in that control, I felt temporarily safe. But safety built on distance slowly erodes intimacy, because intimacy requires vulnerability in real time, not edited vulnerability sent 3 minutes later. The final shift did not come with a dramatic fight or a definitive conclusion. It came one evening when he texted something neutral, and I felt the familiar surge of defensiveness rise in my chest. And instead of responding immediately, instead of analyzing punctuation or reading emotional subtext into brevity, I put my phone down and walked into the room where he was sitting. And I asked him what he meant out loud, and in that moment I saw how much of our online conflict had been built on interpretation rather than intention. He looked surprised. Not defensive, just surprised. And that subtle difference unraveled something inside me. The real damage wasn't that we fought more online. It was that we trusted our fears more than we trusted each other when a screen was involved. The screen didn't amplify our voices. It amplified our insecurities. I began recalibrating quietly after that, not by banning digital conversations or enforcing strict rules, but by refusing to let interpretation outrun reality, by challenging my own assumptions before pressing send, by remembering that absence of warmth in text is not proof of absence of care in a person. There is a peculiar discipline in choosing to pause long enough to ask instead of accuse, long enough to clarify instead of conclude. And that discipline felt less dramatic than our previous arguments, but infinitely more powerful because it restored something subtle, my internal steadiness. We still disagree, but we do it differently. Not because the phone changed, but because I did. I stopped fighting shadows and started speaking to the person in front of me, even if that meant walking into the next room instead of winning the next message. I've shared the journey of learning to recognize what truly matters in love, boundaries, and self-awareness. If you want a gentle guide to understanding your own patterns, gaining clarity, and cultivating meaningful connections, this ebook can support that reflection. You can download the ebook in the description. The link is in the description.